Hello, I'm Dearlove. My guest today is Professor Gary Hamel. Gary is quite possibly management's greatest champion and also its harshest critic. He's written a number of influential books, which include Competing for the Future, which he wrote with C.K. Prahalad, Leading the Revolution, and most recently his book The Future of Management. In it, he calls for a root and branch overhaul of management and really asks managers to reinvent their discipline and their profession for something he calls Management 2.0. Gary, welcome.
Nice to be here.
I've just introduced you as management's sort of greatest critic as well as greatest champion. What's wrong with management now that we need to remake it?
You know, I think we have to start by asking, why did we invent management in the first place? And we don't often think about management as a technology, but I argue it is a technology. It's the technology of human accomplishment. It's what we use to do things at scale as human beings. And, management in some sense goes back as far as recorded history, but really modern management got created about 120 years ago to solve one primary problem, which is how do you take semi-skilled or illiterate people and get them to do the same things over and over again with ever-improving efficiency. That was an important problem to solve. The fact that today you can have a couple of cars in the garage, a digital device in every pocket, that you're not spending 80% of your time cultivating your own food. All of this is thanks to that group of management pioneers who figured out how to do things at scale in highly productive ways. Unfortunately, efficiency and simply doing things at large scale, that's no longer the most important problem for most organizations today. They're worrying about how do we become more adaptable, how do we become more innovative, how do we truly engage the minds and creative energies of the people who work within our organizations. And these are problems that largely lie outside the scope of our old kind of management 1.0 model.
Okay. So you've actually started, you've put your reputation where your mouth is, and you've started this Management Innovation Lab, the M-Lab. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we're still kind of in the formative stages of that, but what we really started to ask ourselves was, what is management's equivalent of the Human Genome Project, or putting someone on the moon, or finding a cure for AIDS? I mean, why can't we dramatically change this technology that so often we just take for granted? We perpetuate the practices and principles that have been with us for the last 100 years. So it's really a project aimed at accelerating the evolution of this technology. And the primary way we're hoping to do that is to create an open innovation platform where people from around the world can contribute their breakthrough ideas on how do we get better at allocating resources, creating our plans, setting direction, measuring performance, compensating, motivating human beings. But what we're really trying to do is create an opportunity where anybody around the world has the chance to hack management, if you will.
And we're talking specifically about management innovation, which is different to innovation per se. Can you explain exactly what the difference is?
Yeah, I think we can think almost of a hierarchy of innovation, if you will. At the bottom is operational innovation, the things organizations do every day to get incrementally more efficient, more productive. A lot of stuff goes on around IT, customer support, and so on. A level up from that, you have product innovation of the sort that, delivers the latest flat screen television or some new financial instrument. Above that, you have business model innovation that created Facebook, IKEA, Southwest Airlines, pick your example. But really at the top you have management innovation. So fundamental breakthroughs in the way we organize human beings in productive ways. And if you go back over the last 100 and so years of industrial history, what you'll find is that the most significant and enduring shifts in competitive advantage came not from innovation in products, technology, business models, but they came from innovation in management itself. So management innovation is anything that changes the way the work of management gets done, how we allocate, plan, direct, and so on, or changes who does that work. And in an organization of any size, the only way you change the work of management is by changing the processes, the routines that govern the way that work gets done, how you submit a budget requisition, how you evaluate an employee, and so on. So management innovation is really focused on those core management processes that drive any organization forward.
Can you give me some examples? You mentioned the big management innovations over the last 100 years. What are the really significant?
So a few examples. Let me pick 3 or 4 that be clear standouts. Back at the very beginning of the 20th century, General Electric worked with Thomas Edison to invent the world's first R&D labs. People have been doing science for a long time, but GE brought management discipline to science. So Edison could say, we can now create a minor breakthrough every 6 weeks, a major breakthrough every 6 months. No one before had ever put science on a schedule, and within a couple of decades, GE has more industrial patents than any company in the world. you go forward a decade or so, a couple of decades, and General Motors was this big sprawling empire, kind of no economies of scale or scope. The chairman at the time turned to a young staffer, Alfred Sloan, said, how do we get some order to this chaos? And he invented the notion of the divisionalized organization, centralized finance, policy, decentralized operations, and that would become the template for every multi-business company since. I mean, every large organization has some General Motors DNA in it. Sadly, that was the last time GM was a bona fide management innovator. Coming kind of a bit more recently, Toyota, 30-some years ago, one of their great breakthroughs was the notion of employee-focused problem solving. So how do you take first-line employees, teach them statistical process control, Pareto analysis, and hold them responsible for improving quality, efficiency, and so on over time, which is a radical breakthrough with the past. More recently, we see things like open innovation. I think even a decade ago, if we'd surveyed 1,000 CEOs across the world and said, can you foresee a time when a ragtag collection of volunteers around the world with little in the way of hierarchy or formal management processes will create things as complex as a computer operating systems with millions of lines of code? I think many people would have had a hard time imagining that could be true. So those are a few examples of kind of the really signal changes in how we think about management. And when you go back and you look at how a lot of those changes happened, you find that it often involved a fairly tight collaboration between a very progressive manager and then often somebody out of the academic world, starting with Frederick Taylor or Edwards Deming and so on, who worked together to kind of really experiment and try things. And sadly, I think over the last couple of decades, we've lost that kind of experimental sense of let's just go try new things in the way we manage, lead, organize, plan, and allocate. And part of what I'm hoping to do, both inside organizations and very much in the community of management faculty, is to rekindle that spirit of adventure and experimentation in how we do the work of management.
Do you think, is that because people are under too much pressure now? Is it because we've got this short-termism? CEOs are constantly having to report to Wall Street to say, profits are up again. Does that not give us any space to experiment? Do you think that's part of it?
I think that certainly pressures organizations, and sometimes it makes it difficult to try things that don't have an immediate payoff. But I would have said the much bigger thing holding us back is our own embedded management models. The fact of the matter, if you think of management as a technology, if you plotted its evolution over the last 100 years or so, you'd find that it follows this kind of very classic S-curve where there's a lot of innovation at the beginning and then it flattens out. And certainly over my lifetime, the way we manage our organizations has changed hardly at all. I mean, if we could somehow resurrect a 1960s era CEO, we put them back in the executive suite, there's certain things that would surprise them, the 24/7 pace of business, the amount of information they had at their fingertips. But much of the way we manage would be very familiar to them. The hierarchy still looks pretty much like it always did. People with big titles and big positions still make the big decisions. Power, pretty much flows top down. Credentials determine share of voice. All of those things, budgeting works like it always has, and so on. And indeed, when you go from organization to organization, even today, you find that the technology of management varies only slightly from firm to firm. That's why a CEO can leave, go from one industry, somebody can go from running Nokia to, being the chairman of Shell, and you walk into the executive suite, the levers and dials are pretty much in the same place, which, by the way, is another way of saying that most organizations don't have a management advantage. Despite all the work, all the energy they put into all those processes, very little of that creates anything that's truly distinctive in terms of organizational capability. But I think the reason, if you think, well, why has management stopped evolving? There's, a couple of possible hypotheses. One is we've solved all the really tough problems. I mean, we know how to run these great global organizations with people all over the world, and we can coordinate massive projects. So, there's nothing really new to be done anymore. I think the second and more likely hypothesis, we're all just being held hostage by the same set of hand-me-down beliefs that we inherited, from ex-CEOs, management gurus, pioneers, most of whom are long dead, long retired, or long in the tooth. But we've kind of just assumed that's the only way to do it until somebody comes along and says, maybe there's something a different way.